So what are the challenges that organisations face currently and over the next few years? We hear a lot about doing more with less. Now, to an extent, that's sort of macho, asset-sweating talk. But it's actually the reality for many people. I know lots of organisations. I know one organisation where they've cut their headcount by, 15%. The board are really worried about the impact that's going to have on the psychological well-being of the workforce. Although I suspect, if they're honest, it's more about getting bad headlines than productivity or a genuine concern about people's health and well-being. Their health and well-being team was reduced to one person during this headcount reduction, and that person's now gone off with depression. Now, perhaps that's a caricature. I don't think it is. And so one of the real concerns and challenges for businesses is if you are trying to do more with less and crank out more productivity from the resources you've got, you just have to accept that keeping that pressure on is not sustainable without doing something about the physical and psychological well-being of the workforce, because it just can't last. People have their limits. And whilst those might vary individual by individual, just look at your data, because that will tell you, it'll give you some lead indicators of the problems that you're going to have. I think we have, not only do we have a problem with disclosure, because many people with psychological problems or long-term physical conditions still have always found it difficult to disclose their condition to their boss or to their co-workers. I think we've got a different problem, because it's clear that in some parts of the economy there are organisations, particularly in the public sector, has been my most recent experience, where sickness absence records are being used as a criterion for selection for redundancy. Now, that, of course, together with perhaps more you might call draconian approaches to managing attendance at work, is putting a lot of pressure on people to come to work when they might not necessarily be well enough to do so. So I think we have the additional issue of people feeling pressured to come to work when they're not perhaps well enough, and secondly, the consequences of productivity of people being, having sickness presence, if you like, or presenteeism, which is something which seems to be growing. Early intervention is, I think, a big challenge for organisations. If people aren't disclosing, then they can't get access to early interventions through occupational health or EAPs or other mechanisms that are there to help them. And I think this is a big problem. There are things that can be done for people who develop psychological issues quite early on, but if they're left to drift, then they get worse and worse. And I think that's a problem that actually largely is something that line managers need to think about. Managers, by and large, can pick out the early warning signs of people developing distress or anxiety. They need to be supported by occupational health. They need to be supported by their organisations. BT is a great example of this with in the case of mental health, that managers actually feel empowered to spot those signs and then refer people on if they think there's a problem. Quite often these problems manifest themselves as a dip in performance or lateness, or perhaps even people not taking as much care of their personal appearance or personal habits and so on. Those little tiny signs that people would only spot if you work with someone regularly are things that organisations like BT are now training their managers to pick up on. And I think more organisations need to think about empowering their line managers to intervene early in this process rather than just letting things drift. I've mentioned financial well-being. I think it's part of your responsibility as an employer, if you think this is an issue, to do more to be alive to the fact that some people are finding it really difficult out there. The Work Foundation is doing a piece of research called the Bottom 10 Million, because there are 10 million people in the UK who are earning less than £15,000 a year. They're in work, but they're on the poverty line. And this is often an ignored group. We talk about people on welfare and so on, and that deserves attention too. But there's another layer of 10 million people on very low incomes. And I think it's really clear that those people are finding it hard, and they're more susceptible to some aspects of psychological distress than many others. I've talked a little bit about line managers and leadership. Going back to something David McLeod was saying, our data shows that about 40%, only 40% of UK workers think their bosses act with integrity. And I think this is a real problem. We've seen a sort of breakdown in trust in some of our big institutions, MPs' expenses, the church, and so on. There's lots of big institutional issues, the banks obviously, and that is bleeding its way into the way that many people in organisations are perceiving leadership and management in their organisations. In the same survey that we did, 60% of employees said they thought that trust in their organisation was worse than it was 1 year ago. So we're seeing a bit of a crisis here in the sense that people's willingness to trust their managers, to look after the bigger picture in terms of trust and integrity, and perhaps their own well-being, is being undermined.